Hi everyone, my name is Jatinder. I work for the Center for American Progress. The first thing you will notice about me is that I'm not American. I come from a different country, and the work I do at the center focuses on government reform, how you make government more innovative, and how you look for ways to make government more effective. So that's kind of my work at the center. We first wrote about this concept sort of a year and a half ago. And we published a report which talked about it, and since then a lot of people in Washington and elsewhere have got excited by this idea, so we're very pleased about that. Okay, so now you all know a little bit about me. I know some of you in this room, but many of you I don't know, so I want to know a little bit about you. So tell me a little bit about who you are and where you come from. How many of you come from governments? Oh, wow. Lots of people come from governments. Great. That's good, because I come from government. I spent 15 years in the British government, and therefore I sort of look at this very much from the perspective of a government. And I've worked in the nonprofit occasionally, and I've done other things, but my sort of slant tends to be from the governmental perspective. So I feel good about the fact many of you come from government. Okay, so how many of you know a lot about this concept? Okay. How many of you know very little about this concept? Okay, this session is for you guys. This session is not for those of you who put your hand up the first time round. It is very unlikely I'm going to say anything that you don't know if you know a lot about this concept. Indeed, it's likely you're going to be sitting there going, it's not exactly right the way he's put it, because I'm simplifying this on purpose. I'm trying to get the concept across. It's a very complex concept. I'm just trying to get it across so that people understand what it means. Through the day, a lot of the nuances, a lot of the complexities will come out, but we wanted by 10 o'clock to make sure that everybody had at least a basic understanding of what it means. Otherwise, you'll be sitting there through the rest of the day going, not exactly sure what's going on, what is that language they're talking, and as you know, government's good at jargon, and there'll be lots of people today who will speak a lot of jargon, so trying to get people sort of socialized into this space. Okay, I've got some slides. We have a tiny, tiny screen. This is going to be hard work. There is one particular slide which is going to be particularly challenging because it has lots of little type. When we get to that, we're going to try and hand it out so people in the room have access to it. But for the moment, let's try and work with that screen. Okay, so for those of you from government, you will be used to the way government traditionally finances. For those of you from the nonprofit sector, you will also be used to the way government traditionally finances. And if we move to the next slide, you'll be used to something that looks a bit like this. So, we in government create funding streams. Funding streams might focus on different policy areas. So on the slide behind me, you've got one on helping ex-offenders get back into work. There might be a funding stream on that. There might be a funding stream which is like a drug treatment program to help reduce drug dependency. There might be one on housing support, and there might be another one on restorative justice. People familiar with that concept, restorative justice? So there might be another one on that. These funding streams will almost certainly have amounts of money allocated to them, which, if Caitlin clicks, we'll get to them. So I've just made up some numbers here for this example, 20 million all the way down to 5. These funding streams basically will give money to providers. Caitlin. Almost certainly these funding streams will come from different places. So, these in this particular example, you've got 4 government agencies, you've got 4 funding streams. Each of these government agencies give money through their funding streams to providers. That sound familiar? I'm not conning people so far? It's good. Okay, so I think there are various problems with this model. And I probably want to explore in the room first, before I tell you what my prejudices are, what some of the problems are with this model. What's kind of wrong with the way we do stuff here? Siloed? Yep. Yep. Tell you a little bit more about that.
Well, if you're trying to take a developmental approach, like your children and youth are concerned about, doing that in a very siloed way, doesn't meet their developmental goals.
Right. Yes. So interconnection, siloness, agencies often don't work together. I think that's a pretty common problem. Funding streams have different constraints on them. It's a pretty common problem as well. Other thoughts from the room? And I want people who are not so familiar with the concept of pay for success, because you will know the answers. Yes, sir.
Selection of the providers is sometimes political in nature or haphazard, some other, not necessarily tied to some sort of real evidence.
Did you say the selection of the providers?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, absolutely. So the way money flows to providers can be done in this sort of politicized manner. It's a very common problem. Yes? Right, right. Little room for flexibility. And often that's because there are quite strong input controls. You know, actually each funding stream has its own conditions. You know, in order to get money out of this funding stream, you've got to contort yourself into this particular shape. And then to get money out of the next funding stream, you've got to contort yourself into a different shape. And that can be a pretty unpleasant experience. But it can also make you pretty inflexible in terms of what you can do. Yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts? Right, right. Wonderful. OK, any other thoughts? Yes? Right, if you're lucky. Right, it might be the input, right? It might be, you know, if you contort yourself to a particular shape, you promise to do all these things, we'll give you the money. So another thing I would raise is around sort of, you know, responsiveness to performance, which is kind of very similar to your point, which is, you know, actually, if something works really well, so if the third provider in the little green box there is doing an amazing job, it's actually quite hard to expand the money that's going to them. Partly because, you know, there's only 8 million sitting in that drug treatment program. It's quite hard to move money from another funding stream into that program. And often, actually, the data on whether that program is succeeding is not easily accessible. So there's a sort of another set of issues there. Other issues? Inefficiency? Yep, yep. Say a bit more.
Well, I mean, there may be many things around training or applying for the RFPs or whatever that restorative justice and helping ex-offenders and drug treatment, I mean, that are all doing those things.
Right,
but not
right.
doing them together.
Right, and often individuals, you know, like what's missing from this diagram are the beneficiaries, the real people who benefit. Often those individuals actually want a wraparound service which takes account of all of their needs. And what government does is it generates that kind of concept of individualized projects providing one ingredient that helps them, but probably to different people. So, you know, person 1 gets ingredient 1, person 2 gets ingredient 2. Actually, they both need ingredient 1 and 2. You know, government's not always very good at making that a reality. OK, any other thoughts? I'm very pleased with everything you guys have said, because if we go to the next slide, we'll see some of the stuff that I would have predicted. So, you know, I think, you know, just to summarize that, I think some of the issues are, you know, we fund inputs, the point that you were making, or sometimes outputs, but very rarely outcomes. It's hard to know what's actually working, because the way we release money is really focused on your ability to persuade us you're going to do what we need you to persuade us of in order to get our money. It's very rarely focused on whether what you do has worked. That's not something we think about. It's very hard to shift money between programs, and we didn't talk about that so much. But, you know, one particular issue is, you know, these funding streams are set in stone, often through appropriations. If the drug treatment program is very effective, the housing program is ineffective, how likely are you to be able to move the money from the housing program to the drug treatment program? My sense of that is that's harder than we would like it to be. People agree with that statement? And there are lots of bureaucratic reporting. You know, actually, you're sending reports back. And if you're in the non-profit sector, it can be deeply frustrating to have to fill in all these government forms and all this government paperwork all the time to persuade them that you're doing the right thing. And then another problem is that if something really works, it doesn't scale. The amazing drug treatment program in one part of the country, you know, you're from Virginia, you know, how likely is it that the person sitting over here from Connecticut is going to know about the program that you're funding that works so well, such that it travels to Connecticut? You know, my sense is that that's the really big challenge. And in fact, when we at the center got interested in this subject, it was because of that challenge. You know, that was the first thing we were really worried about, is how do you scale stuff? OK, so that's a world we all recognize. It's a world that we all live in. It's a world we occupy. And it's a world that I sense most of us would think could be different. Not easy to work out how it could be different, because it's the way it is for a reason, for lots of reasons that are historic. And actually, the world that we've just talked about is a world that governments around the world find themselves in. It's not a particularly American issue. It's an issue that applies all around the world because of the way that governments operate. OK, so imagine a world which was different. And let's call it pay for success bonds. And imagine a world where you've got keep going. Keep going. Let's imagine we've got 2 people. I'm going to call one of them a government agency, and I'm going to assume, Larry, you're the government agency. for the purpose of this conversation. And I'm going to assume someone else is what I call the deal maker. And I want a deal maker in the room who might be a more realistic deal maker. Who would like to be a deal maker? A Cibio, if you want to call it that, a bit of jargon. Anyone want to volunteer to be a Cibio? Oh, sorry. I didn't see you, George. It's because I'm looking over there. You're right over here. Okay. So George and Larry. George is what I call the deal maker. This is a term that no one else uses. I invented the term for the purposes of today. I didn't want to use the term Cibio because I thought it was kind of complex and I'd have to then explain what it meant. But if you hear the term Cibio, if you hear the term intermediary, or you hear the term deal maker, it means the same thing. So you are a deal maker in this world, and you, Larry, are the government agency. And I want you, I'm kind of imagining a world where you guys do a deal. A deal where basically, oh, that's great. Do you want to imagine that world? This is good. This is good. Okay, so I want a world where you do a deal, and the deal has a particular characteristic in it. You know, in this deal, George is making a promise to deliver an outcome that you want, that you, government, want. And you are promising George that you're going to give George some money when he delivers that outcome for you. Now make up an outcome. Okay? Oh,
Yeah,
you want to?
yeah, supportive housing
Okay.
for homelessness.
Okay. Say a bit more about the outcome.
Specifically, we've quantified that we have X amount of people that are homeless, and we calibrate that if we were to provide a certain number of supportive housing units, it would reduce it by a specific percentage,
Okay.
which would in turn save us
Right. So
X
maybe
amount
I
of
could
dollars.
generalize that a bit and say the outcome you want is a reduction in the number of people who are homeless.
Right.
In a particular part of your state.
Right.
Sort of go with that for a minute. And George says, you know what? In fact, why doesn't George answer this question? There you are, sir.
I think I know some people who could do that for you, Larry.
Okay, so George says he's got a way of making that a reality, and in fact, he's so confident he's got a way of making that a reality that he's not going to ask you for any money until he's made it a reality.
Right.
Which is kind of fun if you're government, right? You know, you don't have to pay for it until it happens. Which, and now the good thing about something like homelessness is it probably costs you something to have people who are homeless, and in deciding how much to give him, you might just be able to work out what money you might save and do some kind of deal with him to give him some proportion of those savings.
What's it worth to you, Larry?
I'd say maybe a third of what we're already paying.
Whoa.
Let's talk.
Time is tight. Government's tight, huh? Fiscally tight in Virginia? Wow.
Or 40%. How's
Either that or you're a hard negotiator. One of the above, huh? Okay, so let's imagine this deal. Let's imagine that from a government perspective, the deal you've done is about an outcome. It is not about a set of inputs. You've not told him what he needs to do. And the deal he's done is about a payment at the point at which the outcome is achieved. Okay?
Right.
Right, so that's the deal that we're talking about. And at the heart, pay for success just means that. You know, there's a lot of other stuff we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but actually at heart, that's all it is. It's a relationship between government and an outside organization such that the government promises the outside organization money in return for the outside organization promising to achieve an outcome. Okay, now it's a little bit more complicated than that. The thing about George is, what did you say? I know some people who can, what did you say? Remind me.
Who can do that for you?
Right. George knows some people who can do that for you. So we're going to get those people on the screen. Those people are providers. That's not different to the normal world. Actually, you know, George, for all of his talents, probably isn't the best provider of homelessness services. I'm guessing. You're not, are you? But George is confident that he can deliver people who, you know, who can deliver the outcome you want. He can make that happen for you. So we have some providers, and then there's a set of relationships between the deal maker and the providers, which are going to flash on the screen. Keep going. And you know, there's two aspects to those relationships. One is that between providers and the deal maker, there's one set of relationships which are that the deal maker funds and manages providers. And both of those terms are important. Funding, because you need funding to flow, but manages. Now, if we go back to where we were in the earlier slide, actually, that's something government finds challenging. Managing in real-time service delivery, you know, from third parties who are often funded through grants, can be a real challenge. George, on the other hand, is massively incentivized to manage these guys really well, right? Because he's not going to give you the money, right? And he's only giving you 30%. Okay. Providers, however, then providers then work with beneficiary populations, and they report progress back pretty regularly to the deal maker in this model. Now, the slight problem with all of this. Anyone spotted a rat? Yes.
I don't know if it's part of it, but I think this idea of getting better results with less money.
Mm-hmm.
I would even question one of the initial challenges is, achieving results within the populations that were listed within those programs is a difficult proposition.
Right.
So I would question even whether or not the current investment level is proportional to what the needs are.
Right.
So that's part of the challenge I see.
No, I agree. I think sort of, we'll come on to that. One of the things is how in a fiscally tight world, where are you from?
Los Angeles.
Okay, so how in a fiscally tight world, where your budgets are probably going to be tighter in the coming years, right? How do you make sure that the amount of money that flows into the services you need, provided to your people, how do you make sure that amount of money is adequate? And one way of doing that might be doing these kind of investor save type deals. And so I was going to come on to that in a bit, but yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what else is missing? Yes. Right. There's no money. There's no money flowing here, right? There's no money from Larry to George until George has achieved the outcome. I'm making Kippy a provider for the purpose of this. Kippy, on the other hand, is actually working with homeless people to get the outcome we're interested in. And Kippy's like, I need to pay salaries for my staff. And so there's no money. Bit of a problem. How might we solve that problem? Any thoughts? Investors, right. So we're going to flash up some investors. So effectively, we do a deal. Effectively, what George does is he says to a group of investors, look, I'm so confident I can do this because you know what? I've actually been up and down the country, and I've found the 5 things that really work in achieving this outcome. And Larry's a nice guy, but he doesn't really have the time to go around the country and find these people. And I can find these approaches, and I can make them a reality in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And if you investors pay me for this, not only can I make this a reality, but actually when I've done it, Larry's going to pay me, and I can give it back to you. So that kind of relationship between investors who effectively pump prime pay for the operational capital, you might call it. They pay for the work to be done in return for the promise that over some length of time they would get their money back because they have confidence that George is a good deal maker. And the reason I chose that term deal maker is because it is the deal maker's right in the middle. They're the person who everything flows through. And they're the person who really needs to be engaged with this idea at a level of detail that is, quite astonishing. So it's a hard job for them, which is why I use that term deal maker and why, the focus is very much on George in this kind of example. Okay, thoughts on this model? Interesting question. Now, I think evaluation sort of has there's 2 ways to think of the word evaluation. I think one way of thinking of the word evaluation is to think about it as, those kind of long-term analyses that are done of whether the thing worked. And, you probably need some concept of evaluation for something like this done just like you do for anything else. But there's another way of thinking of that term evaluation, which is, how often, as you do something, do you learn about how to make it better in real time? And one thing that's interesting is that if you go back to that traditional model, actually we find it quite hard to do that in governments. But George, on the other hand, will be heavily incentivized to do it. Because when provider 2 is not doing a great job, George will be incentivized to either manage provider 2 such they do a good job, or shift resources from the worker provider 2 to provider 1. And it could be provider 2 is just not doing a good job because it doesn't work. The stuff they're doing is not very effective. It's not that they're not very good. It's just that it didn't, George was really confident this approach would work, but, he got that slightly wrong. So he's got incentives to real-time manage in a way that, and so that, for me, that's a form of evaluation because it's evaluating what's happening and working out what to do about it. But if there was an academic in the room, is there an academic in the room? They would tell me it's not evaluation. I'm not an academic. Okay. So that, in a nutshell, is pay for success. That's what it means. Now, it can be different. You know, I've sort of given you a stylized example. It's not that stylized. This is actually the only real example that I've given you. In this real example, which is a prison in the UK, in a town about 50 miles north of London, called Peterborough. I think you pronounce it differently. How do you pronounce it? Peterborough? Peterborough. Okay, sorry. Kippy used to live in England as well. Isn't that hilarious? In this town called Peterborough, or Peterborough, about 50 miles north of London, you know, the British government, my colleagues in London, have done a deal with an external organization basically to say, if you can deliver a reduction in the recidivism rate of the people who come out of that prison, I'm going to give you $20 million. You have a certain amount of time to do it, and we need good measures of whether you actually achieve it, but we're not going to manage what you do. We're only going to manage whether you achieve it and how much money whether we give you the money. You know, that's basically the deal they've done. You know, in that case, that organization is social finance. The deal maker, I don't know if social finance are in the room. Yes, social finance are in the room. Is that a reasonable assumption? Is that a reasonable statement of what the deal you've done in Peterborough? Okay. So, you know, in that particular example, the deal that's been done is between social finance, who are in the room and are going to be talking on the panels this afternoon, and with the British government, who are not speaking. You know, I happen to used to work there, but I don't right now. And there are investors, some of whom are also in the room today. Kippy, I think you are an investor in that pilot. The Rockefeller Foundation is an investor. And there are providers. So that is the example. Now, it doesn't need to be that way. You could imagine it being done differently. You can imagine that actually the deal maker is actually a provider. You can imagine a provider coming along saying, I'm so confident that I can make this work that I'm going to be the deal maker and the first provider. Yes, sir. That's fine.
Can you just really quickly talk about the alternatives? And one of the things, the two that spring to mind would be a pay-for-performance contract.
Yep.
And something like the loan from tax credit, where you have outside providers, you have investors, you have, and you pay a bit of recapture mechanism in that, and analyzing the investors as opposed to.
So I didn't hear the first one. I didn't hear the second one.
The second one is something, a tax credit program like the low-income housing tax credit.
Uh-huh.
That's a program that incentivizes the construction of affordable housing.
Right.
And,
Okay. So this is very different to a tax credit. A tax credit is basically government saying, we would like to incentivize external organizations to do certain things. And if they do those things, we'll give you money. You know, enormous deadweight in that, and all tax credits have deadweight in them for obvious reasons. You know, many of those people would do those things anyway. And there's no real concept of outcomes there. You know, it's often for the activity. You know, tax credit is basically the same as a spending program, just delivered in a different way. But a performance contract is pretty similar to. And you know, a traditional paper performance contract has very significant similarities with what Larry and George were talking about earlier. There are some differences, though. I would say one difference is that often paper performance contracts have a very strong element of payment to do the operation, and then a bonus to do, you know, for achieving the outcome. In this model, the bonus is like 100%, and you know, the operational payment is like 0. Now, it doesn't need to be that way. It could be that there's some number, you know, somewhere between 0 and 100 where it's still pay for success and not. But once it gets to like 80 or 90, it feels to me we're in a pretty standard performance contract. The other thing is that, you know, if you think about the way we talked about this example, this is very much around sort of, you know, almost we came at it from the non-profit angle a bit. You know, it's the non-profit who finds that getting money out of government involves grants, etc. And so you could imagine this being of something that could be of particular benefit to non-profits, partly because of the role that investors play. And who are the investors? To date, they're largely foundations who have a particular interest in that kind of world. They don't have to always be foundations, but to date, they're foundations. Any other questions about the concept? Yes, sir.
Actually, to that point, with not only is there diminishing funds with federal, local government, But there's also diminishing funds within philanthropy, and there's also not just diminishing, but there's most of these funds are programmatically committed. So how do you create the compelling case for philanthropy to invest? Not just the case, but the case that leads to will, that leads to ultimate investment.
Right. If I may, I'm actually going to ask you to have a conversation. Well, maybe I'll ask Kippy to answer that question in a little bit. Why does philanthropy care? I know you want to cover this later in the day, so I know Kippy's going to cover this. But let me just give you one quick answer to that, which is we're changing the terms of the deal for lots of different people here. So the terms of the deal for philanthropy is traditionally you have given grants, and here you're giving investments, and if they work, then government funds you back. The terms of the deal for government are traditionally you have paid for inputs, and you've made those payments regardless of whether they've been effective or not. And here, what we're saying is you're only funding when the outcome happens. So actually, you're shifting a lot of the responsibility that traditionally has been in philanthropy or in government out to this deal maker, and that's relying on the deal maker taking a lot of the responsibility. Yes, sir. Yes.
I wondered, Jatinder, if you could just clarify that this is two different pots of money from foundations. The traditional grants come from the 5% minimum required by the IRS. These investment comes out of the 95% of the endowment, the investment capital portfolio.
Right. So that certainly can be true, and I don't want to speak for foundations for what each of them are doing, but one thing that is different is that because these are investments rather than grants, you can imagine a world where they come out of that endowment, the 95%, rather than the 5%, which is funded by the kind of return on that endowment. So that's a really big difference, and that to some extent helps answer your question, I hope. Yes?
In the UK, with the $20 million in the UK, what was the time period?
Social Finance might correct me, but 3 to 5 years? Is that right? 3 years?
8 for the whole program.
8? Okay. 8. Okay. Any other thoughts on what the model is? Just explanatory stuff. We're going to come on to advantages and disadvantages in a moment. Yes?
I find it fascinating. This is not unlike the more tangible hybrid public-private partnerships that are being done in the infrastructure world. I find this, very, very similar to that.
Right.
And instead of kind of being on that tangible infrastructure side,
Right.
this is really on the social side.
Right.
But the concept and the fundamentals,
Yeah.
in terms of consortiums, investors,
Right.
performance-based sharing risk are all very, very similar to that
Right.
model.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Thank you for making that point. It's a really, really good point. This is familiar territory in a whole load of things that government does. It is unfamiliar territory in the things that are social, to do with people, the kind of soft stuff that government does. And yet that stuff is just as important for society, I believe, and that stuff has just as real returns in terms of what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, let me tell you what I think some of the challenges are. First of all, I think this is complex. There's a lot of people here who need to kind of, all be looking in roughly the same direction before this happens. So it's kind of not worth it if the numbers are very small. If we're talking about a $1 million transaction, maybe that's too small. There's a kind of question there. It's complex. There's relatively high transaction costs here. And so, you need it to be kind of worthwhile for it to be a reality. There's a lot of different, the other thing I'd say is that there's a kind of a, I sometimes describe, we were having the kind of conversation between George and Larry, I sometimes describe that as a bit like a dance. These people who are at the center of the relationship basically need to do a deal about what they feel is right. And that's not an easy dance to do. And it requires high skills, particularly at the government end, also at the kind of deal maker end, in deal right. And particularly in a world where we're worried that procurement officers in government are less strong than they need to be, that can be a particular challenge. Larry, you need to know how much is the right amount of money to promise. If you mispromise, you will lose money on this deal. George needs to know what's the right amount of money to demand. If he misasks, he'll lose money on this deal. This is a difficult deal to do. Okay. It also can't work for everything. It needs to be measurable. This outcome needs to be measurable in a very clear way. In the UK example, there's a control group, every prisoner not coming out of Peterborough prison, and then there's the group, the people coming out of Peterborough prison. And the UK has quite good data about the likely chance of recidivism of the kind of control group, and therefore you can work out whether whether the deal maker is delivering the outcome you want. Yeah, so the control group in the UK is every prisoner who does not come out of Peterborough prison but has similar characteristics. Comes out of every other prison, yeah. Sorry,
Okay.
comes out of every other prison.
Okay, yeah.
That wasn't very clear.
How do you measure recidivism by those that are still in?
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Okay, well, that takes care of
so
that.
we're
All
talking, it's, in Peterborough, the particular type of prisoner,
Right.
short-term prisoners, basically. Typically, government has not provided services for that group of people.
Right.
Now it's doing this deal, saying if you can deliver a reduction of recidivism for that community, we'll give you. But how do you know it's a real reduction in recidivism? And the way you know that is by looking at other prisoners coming out of other prisons
Right.
who are not beneficiaries of the service. So measurability is really important and often a real challenge. And what's the real measurability in this world? That's the kind of question. Another sort of challenge, if I can see him, is there's nothing, in this particular model, there's nothing stopping the deal maker walking. Actually, if a year in, George is like, you've 20 million, or maybe 8 because you were a bit stingy at the front end. You promised him your 8 million, and he's like, I'm never going to get this 8 million. There's no way I'm going to achieve this outcome. He can walk. And so it's kind of hard to imagine this pure model for essential services. Where you have a legal requirement to deliver that service, it's hard to use this model. It's going to work better for other kinds of things. And at the end of the day, we're going to ask you to help us, sort of brainstorm on where it's most appropriate and where it isn't. So that's where we're going to kind of end the conversation today. And outcomes need to flow in a sensible time frame. Investors are not going to wait forever. There's a kind of investor deal. This is the look, isn't it? Okay. It also requires enormous political courage, is another point to make. First of all, actually, in the conversation you guys had, you didn't say you must do it this way. And there's a reason why government tells providers to do things in particular ways. Because if they do them in different ways, we in government worry that what if the media find out and then it makes big news. So actually, if George concludes the best way to if in the Peterborough example, social finance concludes that the best way of reducing recidivism is giving prisoners PlayStations, that I know would be a front-page story on a national newspaper in the UK. We have a very active tabloid press, as I'm sure you all know. The British government can't stop social finance doing that. And when and if that's a front-page story on a national newspaper, the secretary in the relevant ministry doesn't have the power to say, so, what do we do? How do we stop these guys? We've got to write them a little thing saying you mustn't do this. Because they're like, well, it's working. Or maybe it's not working and we're stupid and we want to do it anyway. So that's one issue. There is a real possibility of private sector return here. So there's a real possibility that people in the private sector will make money out of this. Now, whoever was, I can't remember who it was, someone over there was saying, actually, this is familiar territory in other fields, and are we willing to make it familiar territory in this field? That's the kind of question that I would ask. And then the other thing is, it potentially can go, in the model we were talking about a minute ago, we were talking about a government agency doing the deal. When we were talking, we were saying, Larry, you're doing the deal. But actually, the deal could be more than one government agency. Right. Maybe government could act together. And that requires a level of political courage that goes, beyond the norm in many government agencies, in many government environments. So this is not easy. There are significant challenges to make this a reality. But there are also advantages. And I would say, one, and we've talked about them briefly. One is that it allows successful social innovations to scale. Removing input controls from providers can be an amazing thing. And I know as someone who's tried to get grants out of people in the non-profit sector or tried to get contracts, the constraints that people place on you are really challenging. Public money is only allocated to approaches that work, and that's particularly useful in a fiscally tight world. In a world where we're tighter on the money we have, that can be particularly useful. And potentially it could leverage not only philanthropic capital, but also private capital. And we know there's a lot more money in the private capital space than there is in the philanthropic capital space. Okay, so that's pay for success. I think it's incredibly exciting as an idea. If we look at the very final slide, I think questions that we might explore during the day are, what is the potential of this idea? Is this idea potentially useful to you in your world? And how would you need to vary it in your world? Many of you are from government. Many of you have come because you're interested in this idea. Some of you are already implementing it. And so actually this is an opportunity today to both learn from the people who are doing it, but also to kind of walk away with a sense of, well, can I do something with this? There are lots of deal makers in the room today who can help you think through this issue. So today is an opportunity to get into that space. And I think I would encourage you to kind of give it give it the space and the respect it deserves as an idea. I think what's really exciting about the idea is, I cannot imagine us changing the way we do every bit of traditional government financing. I do not imagine that world. This is not an alternative for every dollar that flows through the traditional model. But I can imagine a proportion of government money, particularly for services that fit well in this kind of world, being used in this way. And I can imagine that being potentially probably the most exciting thing in public finance in years, right? This could be amazing. If we can start applying these kind of approaches for a proportion of the money we spend on social issues, that would be amazing. And it could lead to better outcomes for government, it could lead to better outcomes for individuals on the ground, and even better outcomes for investors and foundations. And why do I care about that? The reason I came into public service, because I care about people on the ground. I care about making the world a better place. And every time I see a bit of money spent the wrong way in government, every time I see something in government that isn't quite working or a contract that's mismanaged, I kind of think, surely there's a better way. And so I'm excited by this because I think this could be a better way. So there we are. Yes?
I have a question about, I love the scalability potential and the incentives to scale things up. My question is, in the long view, if something works and the cost incentives for government are proven, over time, would you assume that the deal maker comes out of it and that government pays for this new way of doing business at scale level, or what's the tenure down the road?
I don't know the
works
answer to
well?
that question, and I think people aren't thinking about that question yet because they're pretty excited by the idea of trying to get it going. And I think that's a really important question. I think sort of my instinct to that is there are two answers to that question. One answer to that question is that actually it is the deal maker who has the ability to manage the providers so effectively that if you revert to a model where you remove the deal maker because these things have been proven to be successful, actually you lose that. It's not just who government gives money to, it's also how government releases money, and the deal maker does it in a different way to the way we do it in government. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that some of those kind of ways of working in that the deal maker has started to make a reality are actually applicable and can be kind of transmitted into the public sector. I don't know the answer. There is no, I think that's something people need to work through. I think we've got an end thing. My watch says it's like 50. Is that right? Okay, I'm going to take 2 more minutes so people can do some questions. Yes?
My question, going back to the evaluation issue, whose standards of evidence prevail? Clearly, the evaluators will have different standards. Right. There'll be disagreements over what constitutes reliable, credible evidence. How does that get worked out among the various parties?
I think the answer is that is part of the dance. If we go back to the deal that's being made, the dance between, Larry and George, they're going to have to decide the answer to that question in advance. They cannot renegotiate the answer to that question every sort of 6 months. And so it happens in the UK that this is not a very hard question to answer because there is quite a lot of good data available. But often that won't be true. Often data will be dirty, data will have lags, and so actually working out the answer to that question early is important. You may well need a third party.
Isn't the investor's perspective on that pretty critical? Is it mostly between?
Well, I would say that the central deal is between these two guys. Now, the reality is George can only do the deal because he's got some investors sitting behind him, and the investors will have a strong view about what's acceptable and they need persuading. But I'm hoping Larry doesn't have to talk to the investor. And the question that you're asking is really about under what circumstances would Larry release the money? Yes? I think you might be the last question.
I have a question about the payback, really from 2 points of view. One, if you're looking, let's say, to take the UK example, 8 years down the track, there's a political risk in terms of whether the government of the time is going to be in a position to fund it. And secondly, the payback could be calculated on the basis of savings over many years that government would be making, so that the sum could be quite a significant amount to pay at any given moment. So how would government manage that?
I think the political risk is real, and I'm really pleased you raised that. You know, I think the deal maker is taking a risk that the future Larry will basically try and renege on the deal. No, actually, that risk exists in lots and lots of contracting between governments. You know, when you do a negotiation to build a road or a bridge or an Olympic stadium, as we're doing in the UK, that's an issue in that kind of context. So, you know, so there's kind of a series of issues around governmental change, and that is a risk that you're taking into account. You know, I suppose, you know, public budgeting has to take account of long-term cost savings. And I think there is a question whether the appropriation system is comfortable with that. Now, while we're talking about 0.0000, I don't know how many, 0.1% of public finances, this is like a small issue. When the numbers get bigger, this would be an issue, and I think people need to get into it. Okay, I think I've had so many funny faces saying, why don't you stop, that I think time to stop has come. In about 7 minutes, I think the next bit of the session starts. Oh, no, now, okay, not at 10 o'clock. Those people who are coming at 10 o'clock are going to be late. Okay, so I'm here all day. Anybody got any questions, come and grab me. And good luck. Enjoy.